evening, day walkers and night stalkers. It's me, your twisted Southern horror queen, coming to you live from under a full moon right here in southeastern Louisiana. I'm glad you guys are hanging out with me tonight. As usual, I got all kinds of creepy, crazy stuff lined up for you guys to check out. Of course, I do because we don't talk about unicorns and sparkly things here on the Twisted Southern Horror Queen show. You already knew that because you wouldn't be hanging out here if you didn't, right? All right, so now that we've established that we don't do cutesy here on the Twisted Southern Horror Queen show, let's change the subject and let me get my shout outs out of the way this evening for the Adrian's Fury Dragster sponsors. There's Renegade Racing Fuel, Amelie Oil, D&M Graphics, Surreal Studios, and of course, one of my favorites, Naked Wines. Got to get you some of this. I'm telling you, it's awesome. No question why they're named Naked Wines. Drink enough of that right there, somebody's going to get naked. I assure you, it's going to happen. All right, so I also need to give another little shout out to the Moonshine Man, Wade Cuevas, for the further corruption of both myself and Big Johnny Blender. Oh, and speaking of corrupt, if you can't get enough madness out of just one show per week, feel free to stalk me at authorlyngibson.com. You'll find my books there, my blogs, and coming soon, there'll be a link there to Movie Lovers Unite magazine, where I do a column for our boy Glenn Spillman. Got to check that out. Just more creepy. Got to share that with the world. It's like a virus. It's contagious and it's spreading. Also, there's some huge announcements going to be coming up in the next week or so. Can't really tell you guys anything about it. You can torture me. You can threaten me. Hell, I'll even loan you my whip if you want to, but that's all just foreplay. You're getting nothing out of me. It will come eventually, though, so stay tuned for announcements on the Southern Horror Queen Facebook fan page and, of course, right here on the Twisted Southern Horror Queen show. All right, so with all that being said, you guys know what you got to do. It's time to dim the lights, kick out the damn kids, lock the door. Don't forget that part because the little bastards will come back. And grab your tasty adult beverage because we're about to get our scary on up in here. Had to do it. Okay, so tonight I'm starting out with all kinds of deranged little things going on. We're going to talk about the Omni-Parker House Hotel. That is said to be one of the most historic and haunted hotels in Boston. It was originally built in 1855 and then rebuilt in 1927. And there's all kind of madness behind that, but I'll give you guys a blog on that one day so I can share all the details with you. Got to give a couple shout outs. I see Ronnie and Lori Owens are in the house, and there's my boy Lawrence joining us from the Crescent City. How's things over in the Big Easy tonight, my boy? All right, so not only does this hotel have a creepy, crazy history of its own, but so does the little piece of ground that it sits on. This site used to be the location of the Boston Latin School in the 18th and 19th century, as well as the location of the old Miko Mansion during the pre-Revolutionary War era. There were a couple of executions that took place right there on that ground. And that school for the Latino kids, it burnt with several of them in it. I think there were like 23 kids in it when it burnt the first time. And then you noticed I said it was there in the 19th century as well. That's when they rebuilt it, and it was moved a little bit later on down the street and across the street. So anyway, today the hotel is located across the street from historic King's Chapel. It's that's a graveyard, and y'all know I'm going to get off topic when it comes to a graveyard. I just can't pass it up. So I got to tell you guys a little bit about this boneyard over there. Now, of course, it's haunted because I wouldn't be talking about it if it wasn't. But it's actually one of the oldest cemeteries over there in Boston. From what I understand, they've been putting bodies in the ground there since somewhere in the 1600s. But there's one legend that says if you walk into this cemetery after nightfall and you knock 3 times on any one of the graves, not one in particular, you need to ask the notorious Captain Kidd why he was hanged. Now, you're probably not going to get an answer, but every once in a while you do get some kind of a little blurb on an EVP. But what you do get is this looming presence that hangs out with you for the rest of the time that you're there in the cemetery that evening. It's going to follow you around, and some folks have reported that it's actually followed them home. Not something I'd want to bring home with me, kind of like a bad date from a bar. You don't want to wake up with that, folks. So just don't do it. It also says if you're persistent and you decide you're going to knock more than 3 times on one of the graves, you're going to piss him off. And you're probably going to wind up with a whole lot more on your ghost hunt than what you bargained for. Karen Vest is in the house. Hey, my girl, went to school with her. She's known me since I was a little bitty twisted thing. And Andrew Wireman's in the house. Good to see you joining me. I love to corrupt new people. Also, let's see. So the boneyard was established around the 1600s, like I said. There's about 1,000 bodies that's crammed into this little bitty tiny graveyard. And it's a historical fact that some of these graves actually contain up to 20 bodies. The marker that's on the grave, if there is one, is only for the last body that was slung in the hole. So now there's a lot of interesting folks that are buried here. Of course, you got some of the founding fathers. The first European woman to step off the Mayflower's buried there. William Dawes, which is one of the dudes that rode with Paul Revere on that famous Lantern Night, and the first woman convicted of murder in that area. She's also hanging out there. So you gotta love that. By 1810, these graves were, they were kind of in the way. They weren't resting in peace, and they're not resting in peace now, that's for sure. So, I mean, even besides the fact that you've got bodies that are jam-packed into graves and other things that were going on, there were several expansions there at King's Chapel. 2 of them, in fact, actually required that some of these bodies be exhumed and moved, reburied there in the graveyard. And trust me, y'all, it wasn't done all reverently and things. They were in the way and they were dead. They didn't have a voice. So it's just get the bodies out of the way, right? Well, by 1810, these graves started sinking, and sometimes coffins and body parts were poking up from out of the ground. So the then sitting superintendent, thinking he was doing the right thing, decides he's going to clean everything up. So he covers up all the bodies in the coffins, and he pulls up all the remaining headstones, and he rearranges them all neatly in rows, regardless of where the bodies were and regardless of whose headstones they were. They just got neatly organized, and the cemetery looked all conforming and everything now, except for under the ground. So yeah, the spirits were pissed, and they're still pissed from what I understand today. I mean, how would you like to be buried in a hole with the bodies of 18 or 19 other folks that you don't know who the hell they are being thrown in on top of you, and there you sit for eternity? No, I say cremation, but that's just me. So yeah, not happy. And speaking of not happy, no burials are ever a happy event, but it really sucks when you're still alive. Yeah, that went down in this graveyard, actually at 1820. This dude's family supposedly buried him alive so they could get their grubby little hands on his cash. What a dick move, right? And then there was this other kind of gruesome burial there too. This chick's body was being prepared for her services, and the coffin maker goes and picks up the body and goes to put her in the box, and he realized he made the box a little bit too small for you, girl. So he decided he was going to remedy that little technical issue by grabbing the nearest hacksaw and taking off the lower part of her legs and her feet. Problem solved, right? So yeah, there's been all kind of crazy sightings there, along with the sounds of voices and floating lights and other unidentified creepy things spotted moving around among the now neatly arranged headstones. Brian Hell, good to see you. Hey, Kim, good to see you. I haven't seen you hanging out with us for a while. I was missing you. Hope everything's going good. Go home and make sure you slap old boy upside the head. Tell him that was from me. Hey, Rex, good to see you hanging out with me tonight. Stay tuned. It's getting crazier, dude. Okay, so back to the Omni-Parker Hotel. It's actually 2 buildings. Now, the main building sits in the front, of course, and then there's a 10-floor annex behind it. The Omni still sits there today on the corner of Chapman Place and Bosworth Street if you want to go visit, just if you happen to be in the area. Now, there's a whole bunch of crazy ghost stories that are attached to this building. Like what I did there. Check this out. So, on the 10th floor of the annex, you're likely to encounter one of numerous ghosts that hang out there, including Harvey D. Parker himself. So, there's a lot of stories about folks running into Harvey, but this one in particular comes from a bellman that started working there in 1941. So this dude says that in the early 50s, there was this old chick that came to stay there. Well, she reported that she saw this apparition standing outside the door at room 1078. She said she saw this tall, misty figure, but then when it turned toward her, she saw that it was a heavy-set older man with a black mustache. Dead ringer for Parker, right? So she's freaking out, and she says that he turned towards her and then he just all of a sudden faded away. So she hobbles her old ass down to the register desk at the bottom floor, and she's ranting and freaking about this ghost that she's just seen. Well, security hauls ass up to the 10th floor to check it out, but of course, by the time they got there, there was nothing to be found, at least nothing like what she had described. Hey, Brandon Vale, good to see you. So there's also reports of a bearded man that's dressed in colonial clothing that's been seen on both the 9th and the 10th floors there. And one lucky guest got some lanyard when he actually appeared at the foot of their bed. They were staying in room 1012 if you want to make a note of that. Now, on the 3rd floor of the main building, over the years, this one elevator does all kind of crazy shit. It's got this habit of repeatedly showing up on the 3rd floor, and it opens its doors with nobody inside, and of course nobody had summoned for the elevator to come down there. It just all of a sudden shows up empty. And it's been doing that for years. It's done it hundreds and hundreds of times. Now here's a kicker on this one. There was this reporter for the American Statesman. Her name was Becky Hensley. She was staying there for a couple of days, and she actually saw this go down. So by the 3rd or 4th time she sees this elevator go down, come back up, open up the doors, nobody's there, go away, come back, open up, nobody's there. She decides she's going to go down to the front desk thinking there's some kind of mechanical failure going on. So she goes downstairs and she reports it to the chick at the front desk. Well, this chick that's working there is like, oh yeah, it's been doing that since Charlotte Cushman died there. Now, Charlotte Cushman was an actress that died of pneumonia during a long battle with breast cancer in a room on the 3rd floor of the hotel on the morning of February 18th, 1876. Is that crazy or what? So also on the 3rd floor is room 303. It's the most well-known ghost reported room there in the hotel. The story is that in 1949, this liquor salesman killed himself by ODing on whiskey and barbiturates. Now, guests have since reported smelling whiskey, and they hear the sound of this raucous laughter in the room. And after complaints, or millions of complaints from different guests, the room eventually was converted into a storage closet. Here's the cool part. Now, a lot of people believe that Stephen King's short story 1408, which if you haven't seen the flick, do that. Pretty cool little film. They say that 1408 is based on the haunting of room 303. The legend or the story is behind that King often stays at the Parker house when he comes to Boston for Red Sox games. Now, during one of these visits, he reportedly heard about the haunting, and he decided to write a short story about it. The short story is about a writer who's doing research for his nonfiction book, 10 Nights in 10 Haunted Hotels. And he spends the night in a hotel where a number of deaths have occurred. If you've seen the movie, that's ringing a bell with you. And then there's this haunted mirror where a number of strange occurrences have also happened. That's on the mezzanine level. And it's the same mirror that was once in Charles Dickens' room. That's right, Charles Dickens actually stayed there. He would stand in front of this mirror and recite his poetry and his stories, just to get the linguistics, I guess, right. I don't know what he was doing. I don't do that. Maybe I should start doing that. Anyway, this mirror is about 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, and it's got this ornately carved frame. And it's said to do odd things when somebody stands in front of it and calls out Charles Dickens 3 times in a row, just like Bloody Mary. I wonder if he's trying to make some kind of connection there in the afterlife. Also, there's this one staff member that had some kind of a hellish experience with it one time. He was there cleaning the window, and as he's standing there wiping our mirror, as he's standing there wiping the mirror down, he kept seeing this fog appearing on it, like somebody was standing over his shoulder and breathing on the mirror. So the mirror is either being cleaned by somebody else or it's mighty dusty these days, because that employee says he ain't touching the damn thing again, ever. So there's also a ghost that hangs out at the Parker in a storage room on the same level of this hotel. The manager of guest services had a run-in with him back in 2010. Check this out. Y'all going to like this. He was on that level and he had to run to the storage closet for something. And when he gets there, he hears, "What do you want?" in this rough voice, kind of like me at 6 o'clock in the morning. "What do you want?" "Coffee." So he's looking around. There's nobody there. And he realized that there's actually nobody on this entire floor. Well, the manager recognized the voice after he calmed down. He realized that it was the voice of an old bell captain that used to work there. Now, from what he says, apparently this dude was a little bit of a drinker. He was in the habit of bar hopping when he got off work, and by the time he staggered back to the hotel, he usually went and hid in that closet to sleep it off until it was time for a shift to start back up. The problem is that he had been dead for several years when the service manager had this experience. So, hoping you guys are enjoying the show so far. Donnie, good to see you. John Bering, hadn't seen you in a while, honey. Hope everything's going well with you. Ronnie Bryant, Susie Jones, my girl. Kisses from Louisiana. Jay Hodge, great to see all you guys hanging out with me tonight. Stay tuned. I've got more creepy. You know I've always got more creepy for you. Because since we started out talking about hotels, I guess we're going to go ahead and talk about the Stanley Hotel. Ever hear of that? Yeah, you have. You're going, "That sounds familiar. I just can't place it. Let me hook you up." This is the place where Stephen King and his wife stayed on one off season. After he had a ghostly encounter of his own, King was inspired to write The Shining. Oh, yeah. Now you remember, right? Red Room, Red Room. I'll tell you a funny story. My husband and I have matching shirts that have the twins on it, and it says Red Room, and we wound up wearing them to my mother-in-law's one day, and she looked at them. She says, "Oh, my God, those are the ugliest children." I said, "Well, Miss Audrey, they're dead." Just thought you'd get a little kick out of that. All right, so the Stanley was constructed over a period of 2 years by F.O. Stanley and his wife, Flora. When it was completed in 1909, it was the biggest and most modern creature of its kind. Among all of the amenities there, it actually had telephones, it had a fleet of cars, it had running water, y'all. It was big time, right? It even had a nearby hydro plant that Stanley himself had designed to provide electricity to the hotel. That's right, they had power too, y'all. The grounds, which is about 160 acres, were purchased from the 4th Earl of Dunraven, who is said to usually hang out in his regular room there, which is room 407, if you're going to be visiting anytime soon. They say that typically the Earl is seen standing in the corner of his room, looking out of his window, checking out the guests as they arrive. You'll know it's him because you're going to smell cigar smoke, and you may actually see some too. Speedy Joe West, glad to see you. Hey, Chris Seal, back for more, huh? Good to see you. Let's see, we got Lisa. We got Rhonda. Has it thawed out there in Kentucky yet? Probably not, huh? No more school for the children's. So anyway, as a matter of fact, there are a lot of the guests that love the Stanley so much that apparently they've checked in to spend their afterlife there. One visitor in particular that we're all aware of, which is still amongst the living, is Stephen King. Now, King and his wife checked into the Stanley right at the end of tourist season one year. The setting was much like it was for the Torrance family from The Shining. The hotel was basically vacant. The Kings were eating their meals alone in this huge banquet hall with nobody else in there, with this ballroom music echoing down these massive hallways. Yeah, those are some eerie settings and wild motivation for twisted minds of horror writers, not unlike myself. So King even actually had an encounter with the ghost of a small boy during his visit there. Now, the meeting was pretty much uneventful. It was just kind of like a sighting and, okay, I see you and it saw me thing. But it was the nightmares that started plaguing him after his encounter that sparked the idea for this 1977 novel. So, back to the Stanley ghosts. Of course, the Stanleys themselves can be seen tending to the day-to-day business. Sometimes likes to entertain folks by playing on her antique Steinway piano. Now, the piano's in the ballroom, and a lot of guests have reported hearing music. But when they arrive to check out the scene and see what's going on, some folks have seen her sitting on the bench of the piano playing right before she fades away. And other people have reported hearing the music, seeing no one sitting at the piano, but seeing the keys moving by themselves. That takes dedication right there to play from the afterlife. So F.O. Stanley, of course, continues to monitor the staff regular. He's usually seen behind the counters observing employees as they're tending to their daily routines, but he likes to hang out in the billiards room at the bar, and he's been seen there many, many times sitting at the bar with his own little drink sitting in front of him. Speaking of that, it's just calling to me. So it's the guests and the staff that say that the fourth floor is the most haunted in this hotel. Now, we talked about the Earl already, but room 418 has frequent guests of its own. Many of the fourth floor guests have called the main desk in the middle of the night complaining about these kids playing in the hall and out in front of room 418. Now, a lot of folks have been lucky enough to photograph these spirits in the hallway there. Some of them have actually caught them looking down from the window of 418 as they're walking up to the front of the hotel. I think actually if you look at the teaser for tonight's show, you'll see that picture attached to it. Now, a lot of these people have run, hauled ass from the room because they don't like the kids. I kind of get that, y'all. But the staff itself, they've kind of got used to it. The only issues that they have with the kids is they can't keep the linen straight on the bed up there. They'll go in the room, the bed's all messed up, they change the linens out, remake it, tuck in all the corners nice and tight, and before they can even turn to walk away, you can see the indention where someone is sitting on the bed, messing up all the covers and everything all over again. Hey, Uncle Dub, good to see you. Give Ain't One Dog a hug for me. RJ, nice to see you in the house tonight, too. Hope you're enjoying the creepy. We got it going on for you tonight. So, what's... excuse me, I kind of got a little bit off right there. So y'all know what's driving the fact that I can't find any history of what happened in room 418, why there's these kids there. That bugs the shit out of me if I can't find any background. It's obvious that it's happening. There's plenty of documented evidence. There's EVPs, there's photographs, and of course there's witness statements. But there's no history of what happened there. It makes me crazy. So if any of you guys have ever heard any of the backstory on room 418, I'd love to know what the hell happened there. Okay, so there is another young ghost that tends to hang out there. She likes the concert hall. They've named her Lucy. Now, Lucy, we do know exactly what happened with her. She was a runaway when she was about 13 years old, and some maintenance men found her squatting in the basement of the Stanley. They had gone down there to survey an area because they were fixing to do some major renovations to the ballroom, I think, which was right over her head where they found her. Well, when they found her, they ran her out of the basement, and Lucy was forced to spend the night outside. That night, the temperatures dropped below zero, and they found Lucy the next morning froze to death on the grounds of the Stanley. Sad story. But Lucy doesn't seem to be real bitter, and as a matter of fact, she's not real shy either. She's been photographed tons of times. She's been recorded very often, too. Seems that she's been there for a very, very long time, and she enjoys answering questions by the staff and curious ghost hunters. When she's not being questioned, she's often heard humming distant melodies. Perhaps she's reliving a concert that she had once attended in the Grand Concert Hall. Maybe Lucy can tell us what the hell happened in 418. That's killing me. I gotta know, y'all. Jason Arboral, got to give you a shout out. It's been a long time since I've seen you. I hope everything's going well for you. And then there's room 217. That's the same exact room that King stayed in on his 1974 visit. So there's several versions of what actually happened in this room. But the gist of the story kind of goes like this. They say in 1911, room 217 was the presidential suite. One night in June of that same year, there was this massive thunderstorm that came and it knocked out all the power. So they moved all the guests down to the lobby while the hotel staff was going room by room and lighting these acetylene gas lamps up. Well, room 217 had a gas leak, and when chambermaid Elizabeth Wilson entered the room with a lit candle, there was a massive explosion. This blast destroyed about 10% of the then 70,000 square foot hotel. But thankfully, it was a compression explosion, and that means that it pretty much put its own fire out. If it hadn't have been, the entire wood-framed hotel could have been burned to the ground, and we would have never had The Shining. Anyway, the force of the explosion sent Wilson crashing through the dining room table of the room underneath her. She actually survived this with nothing worse than a couple broken ankles and a multitude of bruises and cuts. Well, Stanley, of course, owner of the hotel, he made good and damn sure that the chambermaid was well taken care of. He paid her regular wages while she was recovering. He took care of all of her medical bills, and then he promoted her to head chambermaid. Wilson wore that title proudly and continued working at the Stanley up until her death in the 1950s. And that's when the hauntings in room 217 began. I want to draw something to your attention. That explosion happened in 1911. She worked there until she died in the 50s. Is that crazy? Now, guests often complain of things being moved around in 217. Sometimes their suitcases are unpacked and their clothes are placed nice and neat in dresser drawers. And then there were times when Miss Wilson must not have been real enthused with the occupants of the room, because they'd come back from visiting and find their shit packed up and ready to leave. She was actually a very proper woman. I'm saying that because if she finds out that there's an unmarried couple that's staying in room 217, Miss Wilson's got a habit of climbing in bed between the two of you to make good and damn sure that y'all stay a proper distance from each other. So other things other than specific ghosts are also recorded or reported there at the Stanley. There's reports of whispers and footsteps and things that disappear and lights that turn themselves on and off when nobody else is around. Now, there have been plenty of tragedies there at the Stanley that would suffice having rooted these hauntings, but perhaps the grounds themselves were haunted long before the hotel was ever built. Greg Hartman, good to see you joining me tonight. So let me tell you about this legend that I ran across. You know, I have to research the ground of a property that's said to be haunted. This is the legend of Miner Bill. Now, Bill was this hermit who lived in Estes Park around the turn of the century. He'd actually relocated to Estes from Trenton, Nebraska in 1883. Now, not many folks encountered Bill, but those that did said that he was crazy insane. There was actually some documented proof of his mental state in 1904 when he was delivered to the Montezuma County Jail. Seems that Bill had some kind of little breakdown and went a little apeshit crazy, and nobody was able to settle him down, so they took him to a doctor who examined him, and the doctor declared that Bill was far worse insane than anybody else he had ever treated. I wonder if we're related. The doctor ordered that Bill be bound by hand and foot and then delivered post-haste to the Colorado State Insane Asylum, where he spent the next year. Well, upon his release, Bill immediately returned and began prospecting in Horseshoe Park, where he later would stake 2 claims. He began construction of a mining road and also built a small cabin for him and his little dog to live in while he manned his claims. Now, in 1915, Bill had a run-in with the federal government after one of their representatives stopped by his mine and asked him to stop cutting down trees. To make matters worse, the construction of the Fall River Road had begun immediately after that, and Bill claimed that that road was interfering with his mining activities. So later that year, Bill gets arrested for stringing barbed wire fences across the planned roadway. While he's in jail, Bill's talking about this evil blue mist demon that wandered the forest where he was living there. The jailers already knew that Bill was thrown off, so they were ignoring pretty much everything he said and just dismissing it as ramblings from a crazy old man. Well, after Bill was released to return to his mining claims, nobody really saw a whole lot out of him, at least sometime until around the 1930s when the attorney of the United States was forcing him out of his claim. Well, after that, Bill wandered into town more and more frequently, and all the folks that encountered him were more than just a little uncomfortable in his presence. He had a tendency to talk to himself, and sometimes in talking to himself, those conversations would evolve into full-fledged arguments, and most of those arguments were based over how to kill this beast that was stalking him. So I could kind of understand freaking out if you're standing out behind Miner Bill in the dollar store while he's screaming about some monster that's stalking him. I would want to get the hell out of the dollar store real quick. But anyway, most of the folks kind of felt sorry for him, and some of them actually allowed Bill to stay in their barns during the coldest part of winter. In fact, Stanley would hire Bill from time to time with little menial bullshit tasks just to make sure he had a warm place to stay, something to eat, and a little bit of spending money if he wanted it. So Bill would stay around town off and on for brief stints, and everybody knew his stories. They'd all heard about the blue mist creature. Bill said that on cloudy nights, this creature would manifest itself from out of this blue mist. He argued the validity by inviting listeners to come to his cabin and see the three-toed claw marks in the snow or on the trunks of the trees that surrounded his cabin. So to further his evidence, Bill actually told people about these animals that had apparently encountered this creature. He'd tell them about stumbling across the skeletons that had been picked clean but were still completely intact. Bill believed that he was responsible for unleashing this creature. He thought it was all his fault. You see, when he was mining, he ran across this rhyolite, or ran across a group or a grouping of rhyolite crystals while he was searching for silver and gold. And he was convinced that this creature had been trapped inside the crystals until he removed them from the mountainside. So maybe it was the guilt that drove him crazy. I'm not real sure. But anyway, one day everybody just kind of woke up and they realized they hadn't seen old Miner Bill hanging around for quite a while. So of course all the wild gossip and speculation started making their way around. Well, the bullshit hits the ears of this retired Army officer named Lewis O'Riordan. Well, O'Riordan, being retired, had nothing better to do with his time, decides he's going to ride out to Estes Park to see if he could find old Miner Bill. Guess what? He found him. O'Riordan returns to town a day later, paled by his experience. Miner Bill and his dog were found dead right in front of Bill's cabin. Their bones had been picked clean. They were held together only by a few remaining strands of ligament. O'Riordan also reported that the only other thing he found on the scene were these huge three-toed footprints and claw marks made by none other than the creature that Bill had been warning everybody about. So maybe poor old bastard wasn't as crazy as everybody thought he was, right? Maybe. So speaking of crazy, we haven't talked about any haunted insane asylums yet. So I got one to throw at you. Letchworth Village Rehabilitation Center. Ever heard of it? It's got a couple little quirky tales with it. Well, this nut house opened in 1911 in the suburbs of York. It was built with the intentions, of course, just like all the rest of them. They wanted to house the physically and mentally disabled and feeble-minded of all ages, from infants to old and crusty. This sucker was sprawled out on 2,300 beautiful acres. It was immaculately landscaped with park-like settings and had over 130 fieldstone buildings. It was actually constructed in response to all the overcrowded insane asylums where the shit was hitting the fan. And of course, it was intended that they would pay strict attention to the comfort and well-being of their patients. All the buildings were about 200 feet apart from each other. All of them had a capacity of 70 patients per building. The patients were housed according to their disabilities, and in most cases, they were all kept separated away from each other. They had very specific rules in mind when it was first opened. None of the buildings were more than 2 stories high. The entire campus was divided into two halves, separated by this beautiful meandering little stream. And on one side of the stream were the chicks, on the other side was the dudes. Pretty basic, right? There was a whole bunch of other little buildings there too. Of course, you had staff housing and doctors' residence and dormitories and schools and laboratories and hospitals and kitchens and workshops, a refrigeration plant, a laundry facility, a gym, and a theater. Kind of sounds like the villages in Florida, but only for nut jobs. So anyway, at first the patients, of course, they were encouraged to make use of the facilities, and they grew their own crops on these small little farms and even raised their own livestock. The Joint was initially tagged as one of the nation's most prestigious and top-notch mental care facilities. But as you've probably already figured out, that shit didn't last for long. It wasn't very long indeed before Letchworth began its descent into a darkness and despair. It started out with these rumors of mistreatment and cruelty, and then came the tales of horrific experiments being conducted down in the dank basements and under the tunnels of the facility there. Healthy male adults, patients who were put out to do work like hard labor, loading tons of coal into storage facilities and building roads, and being forced to work brutally long hours and doing backbreaking work on the farms there. And there were stories of staff abusing the patients with harsh punishment and beatings and rape, and the general attitude of doctors there towards the patients was basically nightmarish. There was actually this annual report from 1921 where Dr. Charles Little explained the three main groups of patients that he had housed there. He said there was the imbecile group, the moron group, and the idiot group. He also mentions in this little annual report that he wants to start using these outcasts as test subjects. Gets interesting there, right? So over the years, Letchworth became underfunded, and of course it was forced to stall the addition of more buildings, yet the population just kept increasing. In the 1920s, the dormitories were already cramped, and by the 40s, the population of the facility had reached double its intended maximum occupancy. Patients were forced to live and sleep in squalor. They were pressed together in rooms that were packed wall to wall with cots. There were reports of food and water shortages, along with other basic necessities that they didn't have none of. The increasingly shitty conditions were most noticeable with the younger patients. These kids were ranging from around 5 years old to 16 years old, and they represented more than half of Letchworth's total population. Visitors reported that these children looked malnourished and sickly. There were rumors that the staff were shoving food down the throats of the kids that refused to eat by using the single communal spoon, meaning they had one spoon that they used to shove food in all of the patients' mouths. Of course, tragically, there was no help for many of the families because most of these patients had been dropped off there, discarded there rather, by their relatives because society saw disabled people as a disgrace at that time, and people didn't want them associated with their family name. Brandon says, sounds like a jail or two I've been in. Stay your ass out of the jail then. You want crazy, you can get plenty of crazy here. You don't have to get locked up for that, my boy. Anyway, the doctors and the staff played down all the rumors, and they'd all been, pretty well versed in making things there in the institution seem like everything was just fine to the folks outside that actually bothered to look. Well, it wasn't until the late 1940s that the public got their first look at the horrors that were going on there. There was this dude named Irving Haberman, and he went in there and took a whole bunch of photographs while he was visiting the facility one day. And there was now no denying these neglected and unbathed patients that were wallowing in filth, as well as the naked patients that were forced to huddle in these special day rooms. Letchworth Village then became known as the Village of Secrets. Despite the fact that the doctors and the staff had been cold busted, Letchworth remained open for business, and by the 1950s, this institution housed over 4,000 patients, and the living conditions were not getting any better. There were people sleeping on mattresses in hallways and even on the bare floor. Yet, even then, the facility remained open and in good standing. It was during this time that one of the most horrifying cases of abuse at Letchworth reared its ugly head. On February 27, 1950, the first human trial of the polio vaccine was carried out on an abandoned 8-year-old patient who was too young and too mentally disabled to give their own consent. So they watched this kid for a couple days and really didn't look like there were any side effects or the kid was having any symptoms from the vaccination. So they decided, what the hell, let's do it to 19 other patients. So they did. 20 patients without giving consent that had no ability to give consent were injected with this polio vaccine. Well, not a whole lot of stink was made about it because these trials are the actual end result of the polio vaccine that's still being used today. Because it was deemed successful, public outrage was basically snuffed by the press. But polio vaccines weren't the only type of experimental testing going on there. These patients at Letchworth were used as human guinea pigs for a shit ton of other clinical trials. And then there's a persistent rumor that these brain samples were being taken from many of these patients against their will and put into storage. Abby Normal, Young Frankenstein. Sorry, I just had this flash of Marty Feldman run through my mind. Thank God he had clothes on. Anyway, Letchworth remained in operation despite all the evidence of abuse and atrocities. In 1972, ABC News featured Letchworth in a report titled Willowbrook, The Last Great Disgrace. It was an investigative piece that was meant to look at the treatment of people with mental disabilities at institutions around the state of New York, particularly children. This documentary focused mostly on the Willowbrook State School on Staten Island, but it did look into other institutions as well. Obviously, Letchworth was one of them. Reporter Geraldo Rivera found conditions at Letchworth were backward and cruel, with disgustingly filthy living conditions, rampant overcrowding, a lack of clothing and bathing, a general neglect of the patient's basic needs. It was additionally found that the facility was hopelessly understaffed by underpaid staff with little interest in the patient's well-being, and that the patients were offered no school, no training, no activities, no kind of education, nothing to keep them occupied. Now, the footage from this report shows a miserable picture of naked children curled up on the floor, kids crying and screaming, and children in wheelchairs that look like they've just been shoved out into the hall and abandoned. And then there's other people with disabilities there that look decidedly underfed and gaunt, children staring forlornly outside of these windows, probably wishing they were outside of those windows or wishing they were dead. And I guess in some sense, the poor souls actually were already ghosts at that point. So Letchworth was eventually sold, and you're going to love this. It became a golf course and a middle school, but a lot of the land and some of the buildings that still sit there are just abandoned, rotting there. The ones that are abandoned, you can see inside the halls and the rooms, they reek of gloom. They're still scattered with moldy beds and rusty chairs. There's old pictures, clothes, shoes, and other personal items just scattered around, left behind by some long forgotten miserable soul. In the gathering rooms, there's still pictures hanging on the walls, long broken TVs sitting there waiting for somebody to come and watch them. Medical equipment scattered everywhere. Houseplants are still hanging from these decaying walls. And in one room in particular, there's a stack of cardboard boxes labeled deaths. It's kind of a grim reminder of patients who were admitted there but never made it out. Now, half a mile away from the main campus of Letchworth is a cemetery that's now known as Old Letchworth Village. It was used for the patients who died there. And of course, the grave markers only reflect a number for the family because nobody wanted the family name associated with a crazy person. I'll leave that alone. Anyway, no way to identify who is in those graves, if they're actually in those graves. And of course, the paperwork, all the documentation. If you want to find it, you could probably go back into that hall and dig through those massive boxes that say dead on the side of them, if you're really that motivated to do that. Lots of folks joining me tonight. Can't see all those names, can't get to all of you quick enough. I see a whole lot of stuff flashing on the screen. Thank all you guys for following me. I'm glad you're enjoying the show. So anyway, considering all the massive amounts of human suffering and tragedies that went down on this place, it's no doubt that folks say this place is just crazy haunted. There's a long list of weird and unexplainable phenomena at Letchworth that visitors have reported. They've heard furniture scraping across the floors, heavy footsteps, disembodied whispers, and knocking on these peeling and stained walls. Some rooms become suddenly and remarkably cold, even in the dead of summer. And of course, there's a ton of EVP phenomena that's recorded there. I think I'll do a future blog on that so you guys can see some of the ghost pictures and maybe see some of these things that I'm describing to you. The spirits of the children that are hanging out there, they seem to be particularly active. There's a lot of reports of giggling and pattering footsteps and playful poltergeist activity, like the visitors' belongings being flung across the rooms or electrical equipment turning off and on. There's evidence of orbs and flickering lights, along with crazy, ominous signs of hauntings. Some folks claim to have been pushed or shoved and even held down on the floor by some unseen force. There was even this one group of investigators that reported seeing this horrifying 7-foot tall apparition with legs that were bent backwards. It had these piercing, glowing white eyes that bared down on him as it walked towards him. It's been suggested that this creature was brought here by means of witchcraft, because one of the rooms has a pentagram on the floor, and it has been reported that there is satanic activity that goes on here on these grounds today. The Institute's hospital seems to be particularly haunted, with the intense sightings of apparitions and heart-stopping sounds and even phantom physical assaults, which are happening there frequently even today. Numerous mysterious photos, videos, and audio recordings have been made of alleged ghosts at Letchworth. Perhaps the most infamous investigation was made by the TV show Ghost Adventures. Google that, folks. These guys documented unexplained noises, light orbs, and EVPs. And one of the team claims that something actually went home with them. Paint a pretty good picture, but blog would be great. I'll do that, Brandon. Okay, so we're going to shift gears one last time for the evening. We're going to talk a little bit about the atrocities of war and the ghosts of those victims that still linger around today. Now, typically when we hear war atrocities, we think back to the German concentration camps where hundreds of thousands of folks were tormented and tortured, and eventually they were killed. Now, it's no big secret now as to what was going on in those places back then. No way you can cover up all that evil, right? So even though the Nazis and their SS men had certainly left a monstrous footprint on history, they are not the target for discussion tonight. Did you know that during the same time that the Germans were running these freakish, grotesque experiments on their prisoners, the Japanese were doing the exact same thing at their own concentration camps? Yeah, don't feel bad. Not many people know about it. In fact, the madness that was going on over there has just recently begun to seep its way out into the public eye. Like I said, ain't no way to cover up that much evil. It's time to talk about Unit 731. So there were all kind of gruesome and unthinkable horrors that went down daily at Unit 731. Under the guise of an epidemic prevention and research facility, experiments for germ warfare and its effects on the human body had been covered up by the Imperial Japanese for decades. Decades! That's insane. Anyway, the ones that were responsible for the torture and torment of hundreds of thousands of victims, they get to live out full lives surrounded by the wealth that they acquired during these dark times. And a lot of these sick bastards were awarded with medals or compensated with prestigious jobs or positions within the Japanese government in return for keeping their mouths shut. Well, the Japanese authorities adamantly denied the atrocities that took place at Unit 731. The truth actually started coming to light in 1984 when photographic evidence started to surface. Now, the site had been excavated and research has begun. The once tormented souls that found peace are now beginning to stir again since the site has been disturbed. And it's no wonder either. Listen to this madness that I dug up. Hey, Jim, good to see you. Got great timing. So up to 10,000 people per day were murdered at this facility. Recent research estimates that nearly 600,000 lost their lives in unimaginably horrific circumstances. Now, 95% of these victims were Chinese or Korean. Many of them were civilians, but some were soldiers. The remainder was mostly represented by prisoners of war that the Japanese allies had taken. Now, the tortures ranged from psychological to all spectrums of physical abuse. The lightest of the experiments, this was the lightest, took place in the rape room, where fathers were forced to rape their daughters and sons were forced to rape their mothers in hopes that a pregnancy would ensue. Those that didn't become pregnant suffered through some of the most gruesome mutilation of genitalia that could ever be imagined, and that was before they were murdered. Those that did become pregnant would be tied down and were forced to watch these ghoulish doctors cut their babies from them, all while unsedated. As if that wasn't bad enough, the mothers would be forced to sit there and watch these doctors murder these infants by performing living autopsies. What kind of hell is there for somebody like that? Anyway, other prisoners were infected with deadly diseases like anthrax and cholera and the bubonic plague. The Japanese were very creative. It's not like all these folks were just injected and boom, it was over with. Some of the subjects were staked to the ground and covered with plague-infested fleas, or locked up in these little cells to be bitten by infected lab rats. These evil bastards would wait until the disease took effect on the subject, and once their health began to deteriorate, these fiendish doctors would perform vivisections on the unsedated victims. That means they'd cut these guys open in order to examine the effects of the disease on the subject's vital organs, all without sedation, all while they're still alive. And then there was this frostbite unit. Wasn't much better. It was also part of the complex. Prisoners would be staked to the ground during the coldest parts of the winter. They'd remain there until they were frozen solid. When their limbs could be broken from their body, they were taken to the frostbite unit in order for the doctors to experiment and better understand the effects of frostbite in hopes of finding better forms of treatment. And then there was the pressure chamber, and that's probably exactly what you're thinking it is. These victims would be crammed into these chambers, and the gauges were cranked up, all just to find out how long the human body could maintain under all this immense pressure. These experiments were usually stopped when the subject's eyeballs popped out. Oh, and then there's the courtyard. Now, I know that sounds all peaceful and serene, right? Not so much. So out in the courtyard, these prisoners would be staked to the ground within close proximity to experimental explosives. And after these bombs were detonated, the subject's remains would be examined in order to discover the effects of the blast. Really? My thoughts, it blew the poor bastards up. How much experiment did that take? I'm pretty certain that, even though my conclusion is unscientifically based, it's got to be at least 100% right? Anyway, I even ran across some experiments that put me in the mind of Madame Lalaurie. Quite often, these doctors would sever limbs from their victims' bodies, and of course, they were unsedated, and they'd sew them back on somewhere else on their body just to see what would happen. Sometimes these twisted doctors would cut these subjects open and rearrange their internal organs just to study the effects. Gangrene was prompted by these doctors as well in order to closer examine its effects on the human body. Well, subjects fell victim to their share of sordid tortures. Some were starved to death. Some were burned to death. Some were injected with animal blood or seawater just to see what the hell would happen. Some were burned to death. Some were buried alive, and some were spun to death on these massive centrifuges. All of this was done in the name of science in order to better establish what we know today as germ warfare. So now that we know more about all the gruesome madness that took place at Unit 731, is it any wonder that this joint's haunted as hell? I should say not. The investigations that have been taken place there and still are ongoing. They're having a whole lot of trouble getting data because the second they pull up on site, all of their equipment shuts down. Nothing that's electrical or battery operated will work there. So any of the research that's done on site has to be completed during the day, because at night the lights are drained damn near as soon as they're turned on because of the presence of the spirits that are haunting the grounds there. There are, of course, strange noises and sorrowful cries and moans and screams of those that died such agonizing and gruesome deaths. There are actually live tours that are ongoing, as well as, like I said, paranormal investigations. And crews are starting to find that it's very difficult to investigate the site, as, like I said, their equipment's failing as soon as they get there. Now, these tour guides during the day will only lead these groups through certain areas of the site, because some of these areas are so active that they're afraid to take the civilians in there. One of those areas in particular is the frostbite ward. Now, guides state that they frequently see the misty forms of victims moving back and forth through the halls there, and there's the sound of heavy breathing and reflections of faces that materialize on flat surfaces, i.e. windows, stainless steel tables, walls, doors. There's a few pictures of those. I'll try to dig one of those up and put that in my blog, because I will be doing a blog on Unit 731 Friday. Stay tuned for that. There's also the sounds of trembling voices that are begging for mercy, as well as the presence of these pissed off entities that want to exact their revenge. I would be one of them. Can't say that I can blame them either. I mean, I can't imagine one single happy memory that would tie these spirits to this place. There's got to be literally tens of thousands of pissed off ghosts hanging out there on those grounds. Like I said, catch my blog this Friday. You'll be able to see a few of the atrocities that I've talked about if you got the stomach to look at them. You just have to wonder how somebody can be that screwed up in the head to take that on and then live with themselves a full life after the fact. But anyway, kiddos, it's about time for me to wrap it up for the evening. So also remember, if you've got a local haunting or urban legend, or you're just curious about one topic or legend in particular and can't find anything out on it on your own, give me a shout. I'd love to dig into stuff like that. And if I can find enough about it, of course, it'll be on a future show. And of course, you're going to get your shout out too. So I want to remind you guys, make sure that you're back here next week. Monday night, 7 Central, 8 Eastern. Catch me, your Twisted Southern Horror Queen, live right here on Facebook. But till then, y'all, keep it creepy. You know I'm going to do that.